John Lennon and Paul McCartney were one of history's greatest songwriting duos, but they were also opposites. Lennon loved raw instinct, fast decisions, and imperfections that felt human. Paul, on the other hand, believed in polish, structure, and control. He could spend hours, even days, sculpting a part until it matched the sound in his head. That difference drove their genius, and it also drove John Lennon crazy. Across the Beatles' catalog, there were songs John believed Paul pushed too far, tracks he felt were over-rehearsed, over-arranged, or overproduced. Here are 10 Beatles songs Lennon thought McCartney overworked, the moments where Paul's obsession met John's frustration. Number 10, Obla di Obla da, 1968. John Lennon famously hated Obla di Obla da, and not quietly, he called it granny music more than once. What bothered him wasn't just the upbeat, bouncy feel, but the endless takes Paul demanded. McCartney pushed the band through version after version, tweaking tiny details in rhythm, tempo, harmonies, and phrasing. To John, the song didn't deserve that much labor. In Lennon's mind, the charm of rock music was spontaneity. If a track didn't come alive naturally, forcing it into existence only made it feel more artificial. And this song felt like the ultimate example. John reportedly walked out of the studio multiple times during the sessions, returning only to sabotage the mood by pounding a harsh piano intro, which ironically became the final version's opening. Lennon later said the track felt forced because Paul wanted it to be perfect. But for John, perfection wasn't the point. If a song required that much work, it simply wasn't meant to be. Obla di became a symbol of Paul's growing control and Lennon's growing resentment. Number 9, Maxwell's Silver Hammer, 1969. If there was one song John Lennon wished had never entered the studio, it was Maxwell's Silver Hammer. To him, the track was the ultimate example of Paul McCartney overworking something that never deserved that much attention in the first place. The song's cheerful melody and dark comic storyline already irritated John. He thought it was childish, forced, and completely at odds with the band's direction. But what truly pushed Lennon over the edge was Paul's determination to perfect every detail. McCartney spent days refining the arrangement, demanding endless takes from a band that had already lost its patience. George and Ringo were miserable, but John was furious. He later said he saw Paul dragging a bad song across the finish line, polishing it until all spontaneity had vanished. John refused to play on large parts of the track, frustrated that Paul treated a lightweight tune like a life-or-death project. Even producer George Martin admitted the sessions were exhausting. To Lennon, the message was clear. Paul cared more about control than collaboration. And Maxwell's Silver Hammer became the clearest sign of that shift. John later summed it up bluntly. Nobody wanted to record it. Paul did. And so we suffered through it. Number 8, Fixing a Hole, 1967.
Fixing a hole where the rain gets in.
John Lennon didn't dislike Fixing a Hole as a song. In fact, he thought it had charm. What irritated him was how Paul micromanaged the recording until the life slowly drained out of it. During the Sgt. Pepper sessions, Paul was entering his most meticulous era, and this track became one of the first examples of McCartney treating a Beatles recording like a solo project with backup musicians. Paul insisted on getting his vocal phrasing perfectly clean. He re-recorded lines repeatedly, adjusting tiny inflections that no one but he noticed. Lennon found the process tedious and unnecessary. To him, the emotion of a song mattered more than precision, and Fixing a Hole originally had a relaxed, dreamy feel that Paul slowly replaced with polished smoothness. What bothered John even more was McCartney handling most of the instrumentation himself. He played the bass, worked directly with the session players, and dictated arrangement choices without collecting input from the rest of the band. Lennon later said the song stopped feeling like a Beatles collaboration and started feeling like Paul chasing an ideal no one else cared about. To John, the song lost some of its natural flow because Paul over-refined it, turning a simple psychedelic tune into something too careful and too controlled. Number 7, Penny Lane, 1967.
Penny Lane, there is a barber showing photographs.
John Lennon admired Penny Lane as a piece of songwriting. He knew Paul had created something vivid, colorful, and undeniably clever. But what pushed John to frustration was how McCartney turned the recording process into a marathon of perfectionism. Instead of capturing the natural charm of the tune, Paul pushed the song through dozens of takes, revisions, edits, and overdubs until every second sounded meticulously sculpted. The song became a showcase for Paul's growing obsession with studio control. He fine-tuned vocal phrasing, rewrote harmonic parts on the spot, and demanded retakes for tiny details Lennon felt no listener would ever notice. The brass parts were recorded repeatedly, each version more elaborate than the last, until Paul finally called in a classical virtuoso, David Mason, to perform the now famous piccolo trumpet solo. Lennon respected the talent, but he felt the track no longer sounded like a band. It sounded like Paul's personal production experiment. To John, Penny Lane symbolized the direction Paul was steering the Beatles, away from instinctive collaboration and toward polished pop architecture. Lennon believed the song lost some of its spontaneity under Paul's relentless refining, that a simple, nostalgic memory had been turned into a glossy studio artifact. For John, it was another moment where Paul's overworking overshadowed the natural soul of the music. Number 6. The Long and Winding Road, 1970.
Long and winding road.
John Lennon had a complicated relationship with The Long and Winding Road. He understood that Paul wanted to create something grand and emotional, but he believed Paul overworked the song long before Phil Spector ever touched it. To John, the endless attempts to perfect the arrangement, the phrasing, and the mood drained the track of its sincerity. Paul would rehearse it obsessively during the Get Back sessions, pushing the band through slow, repetitive takes that felt more like chores than creativity. Lennon later said those sessions were painful because Paul kept tightening the screws on a song that was, in John's eyes, already too sentimental. He believed Paul was trying to force an emotion the band no longer genuinely felt. The Beatles were falling apart, yet McCartney insisted they polish a delicate ballad as if everything was fine. To Lennon, it was artificial, over-arranged before it ever reached Spector's orchestral overdubs. Even more telling, John thought the song exposed how little collaboration remained. He felt Paul didn't want input, he wanted compliance. Paul pressed the band for specific bass lines, exact piano textures, and controlled vocal dynamics. Lennon grew frustrated, feeling like a session musician being instructed rather than a partner contributing ideas. For John, The Long and Winding Road wasn't ruined by Spector. It was overworked by Paul from the very beginning. A beautiful idea polished until it lost its truth. Number 5. Lady Madonna, 1968. John Lennon appreciated the energy of Lady Madonna, but he believed Paul overworked the track to the point where it stopped feeling like a Beatles record. What bothered Lennon wasn't the song itself. It was Paul's growing habit of controlling every layer of the production. McCartney obsessed over the boogie-woogie piano part, re-recording sections repeatedly to get the exact swing he wanted, even when the band was ready to move on. Paul also took over much of the instrumentation, mapping out bass lines, guiding the saxophone session players with extreme precision, and dictating the rhythmic feel down to microscopic details. Lennon felt the process squeezed out the looseness and spontaneity that had defined the early Beatles sound. Instead of capturing a raw groove, Paul polished the track into something John felt was more performance-minded than emotional. Lennon later complained that he barely felt involved, not because Paul excluded him intentionally, but because McCartney worked the song so heavily by himself that collaboration became impossible. To John, a Beatles song should come alive in the room. Lady Madonna came alive only in Paul's head after hours of revision. John admired the final product, but he believed the heart of the track, its original rough joy, got lost somewhere between the 20th and 30th playback. Number 4, Martha, My Dear, 1968.
Martha, my dear.
To John Lennon, Martha, My Dear was the clearest example of Paul McCartney turning a Beatles session into a solo project with guest musicians. The song began as a light, piano-driven tune, something Paul could carry effortlessly. But instead of letting it develop organically with the band, McCartney built the entire track almost entirely on his own. He played piano, arranged the brass parts, guided the orchestral players, and constructed the rhythm section with minimal input from anyone else. Lennon later said he didn't even remember being in the room, because in truth, he wasn't needed. Paul overworked every corner of the song, tweaking sections repeatedly to nail the exact feel he imagined. What bothered John wasn't the music, it was the principle. He believed Beatles songs should be shaped by 4 minds, not 1. When Paul took full control, Lennon felt the soul of collaboration slip away. Even George Harrison grew irritated during these sessions, frustrated that Paul dictated parts that George felt he should be trusted to develop himself. Lennon saw the tension and recognized the pattern. Paul was polishing songs to perfection while pushing the others further to the margins. To Lennon, Martha My Dear sounded more like McCartney featuring the Beatles than a true Beatles track. Not because it was bad, but because Paul worked it far beyond the band's natural chemistry. Number 3, Get Back, 1969. John Lennon didn't hate Get Back, but he despised the way Paul militarized the sessions around it. What was supposed to be a raw, back-to-basics rock track turned into a grinding, emotional battle. Paul pushed the band through endless rehearsals, stopping takes mid-performance to correct timing, emphasize accents, or demand a tighter groove. Lennon believed the song didn't need all that pressure. It needed spontaneity, something the Beatles once had but were rapidly losing. The Get Back Let It Be sessions were already tense, and Paul's leadership style only amplified that tension. John later said he felt like he was being directed, not collaborating. McCartney constantly dictated parts, bass lines, rhythm patterns, even subtle vocal inflections, trying to drag the song toward the exact sound he imagined. For Lennon, the frustration wasn't the song. It was the feeling that Paul no longer trusted the others to shape it naturally. The breaking point came during one rehearsal when George Harrison finally snapped, saying, "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all." Lennon saw that moment as proof that Paul was overworking the music and the people making it. To John, Get Back ended up sounding great, but the process behind it revealed how far Paul had pushed the band beyond their breaking point. The song rocked, yes, but Lennon felt they suffered to get there unnecessarily. Number 2, Hello Goodbye, 1967. John Lennon always felt Hello Goodbye was the textbook example of Paul McCartney over-polishing a song that was never meant to be deep. The track began as a simple wordplay idea, opposites, contrasts, lighthearted fun, but instead of letting it remain a breezy pop tune, Paul pushed it through a long series of rehearsals, vocal overdubs, and structural tweaks that Lennon found completely unnecessary. What frustrated John wasn't the simplicity. It was Paul's attempt to elevate the song into something grand. McCartney fine-tuned the harmonies again and again, demanding perfect phrasing and timing even though the lyrics were playful nonsense. Lennon later said he felt like Paul was dressing up a children's rhyme in a tuxedo. And the studio process reflected that. Countless takes, endless percussion overdubs, and multiple attempts to perfect the fade-out chants. To John, the biggest issue was how little space he had in the recording. He felt sidelined as Paul took control of nearly every element, arranging the backing vocals, guiding the drums, and deciding the structure without real collaboration. Lennon believed the song would have been better if Paul had allowed it to be rougher, more spontaneous, less constructed. In John's view, Hello Goodbye wasn't ruined. It was simply overworked until it became polished pop instead of Beatles magic. Number 1, Let It Be, 1970. John Lennon respected Let It Be as a melody. He even admitted it was one of Paul's strongest emotional ideas. But he believed the recording was pushed far beyond what it needed to be. To Lennon, the song's strength was its simplicity, a gentle piano line, a straightforward message, and a vulnerable vocal. Instead, Paul spent days refining the arrangement, polishing harmonies, adjusting dynamics, and repeatedly re-recording sections to achieve a perfect sense of calm that Lennon felt was artificial. The sessions were already soaked in tension, and John grew frustrated watching Paul steer the song with total control. He felt the track's message of acceptance and peace conflicted with the reality of a band unraveling. While McCartney layered piano textures, coached vocal takes, and pushed for smooth transitions, Lennon believed the truth of the moment, the fractured relationships, was being hidden beneath polish. John later said he felt detached during the process, not because he disliked the song, but because Paul overworked it into something glossy instead of honest. He believed Let It Be didn't need orchestration, didn't need perfect phrasing, didn't need endless refinement. It needed heart, not production. For Lennon, the song remained a classic, but also a symbol of how Paul's perfectionism drowned the raw soul of late-era Beatles.